the secret history they tried to erase. While you were busy learning the sanitized version of history in school textbooks, something extraordinary was being systematically erased from the records. Between 1850 and 1920, a technologically advanced civilization existed on virtually every continent, building impossible structures, generating energy in ways we still don't fully understand, and leaving clues in places so obvious that we've become accustomed to ignoring them. I'm talking about world expositions, international fairs, temporary palaces that appeared overnight and disappeared without a trace. Official history says they were structures of plaster and wood, built in months by ordinary workers. But high-resolution photographs from the time tell a completely different story. They show buildings of solid stone, sophisticated electrical systems decades before official electrification, architecture that defies our understanding of 19th century engineering. And then, mysteriously, it was all demolished, burned, buried, erased from collective memory. Why? What were these structures really? Who built them? And more importantly, what happened to the civilization that created them? Stay with me, because what you're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about our recent history. If you want to know the truth they tried to erase, hit the subscribe button right now, because this journey will change your perspective forever. The cities then appeared out of nowhere. Chicago, 1893. The world's Columbian Exposition transformed muddy swamps into a gleaming metropolis of white marble in less than 2 years. The official story claims that architects like Daniel Burnham coordinated the construction of 200 buildings covering over 600 acres, employing thousands of workers who erected neoclassical palaces, artificial lagoons, elaborate transportation systems, and complete electrical infrastructure. All this supposedly built and from scratch with 19th century technology. The numbers simply don't add up. To put this in context, the Empire State Building, using significantly more advanced 1930s construction technology, took 13 months to complete with 4,000 workers. The Columbian Exposition would have been dozens of times larger, built in a comparable time, with inferior technology. Modern engineers who have analyzed the specifications are baffled. It's not just improbable, it's effectively impossible, and with the resources of the time. But the photographs don't lie. There are the buildings, massive, ornate, seemingly solid. The Manufacturers and Liberal Arts Building alone covered 30 acres, the largest covered structure ever built up to that point. Its interior walls contained multi-level galleries, elaborate staircases, and intricate decorations. Electric lighting was ubiquitous, with thousands of incandescent lamps powered by generators that officially shouldn't have existed on that scale. Yet, Fountain Systems created complex water shows. There was even an elevated electrically powered transportation system circulating through the exposition. And then, in 1894, it all disappeared. The official narrative states that most of the buildings were made of plaster applied over wooden structures, a material called staff, and that they were simply demolished after the event. Some caught fire during the exposition or shortly afterward. Others were dismantled. Virtually nothing remains. Today, you can visit the site and find only the Museum of Science and Industry, one of the very few buildings that survived. But here's what doesn't make sense. High-quality photographs from the time, when enlarged and carefully examined, show features inconsistent with temporary plaster construction, where patterns on surfaces suggest real stone, not simulation. Architectural details include elements that would be economically unfeasible for temporary structures. Drainage systems and foundations, visible in some images, appear permanent, not temporary. And Chicago in 1893 was not an isolated case. Paris had its Universal Exposition in 1889, leaving the Eiffel Tower as the only permanent remnant of a vast city of palaces. San Francisco in 1915 built an entire city in the Bay, called the Panama Pacific International Exposition, which supposedly took 3 years to build and was completely demolished within a year of closing. London, Vienna, Barcelona, Buffalo, St. Louis all hosted similar expositions, all built temporary cities of impressive scale. All demolished them almost completely soon after. The pattern repeats globally for 70 years. The inevitable question arises, if you can build these architectural marvels, why destroy them? The official answer is that they were temporary by design, intended only for the duration of the exposition. But this doesn't explain why permanent buildings weren't simply preserved, especially considering the astronomical cost of construction. It doesn't explain why photographs frequently show crowds protesting the demolitions, wanting to preserve the buildings. It doesn't explain the suspicious fires that consumed several exhibition venues shortly after closing, destroying not only buildings but also records and documentation. If you're starting to question the official narrative and want to help me continue investigating these historical anomalies, hit the subscribe button now, like this video so the algorithm shows this truth to more people, and click the Hypar button to directly support the channel. Every gesture you make allows me to continue delving into these mysteries that they tried to erase from history. Let's embark on this quest for truth together. Architecture that defies explanation. When you examine detailed photographs of these world expositions, something extraordinary emerges. The architecture is not just impressive, it is consistent. From Chicago to Melbourne, from Paris to St. Petersburg, the same styles appear. Grand neoclassical with massive domes, Corinthian columns, ornate facades covered in intricate sculptures, not regional variations of the style, not local interpretations, but an architectural uniformity that suggests a common origin or at least global coordination on a scale difficult to explain in the pre-internet, pre-rapid aviation era. The 1901 Pan American Exposition in Buffalo featured the Electricity Building, a colossal structure crowned by a 120-meter tower called the Tower of Electric Light. Inside, generators supplied electricity to the entire exposition, powering thousands of lamps, transportation systems, and illuminated fountains. The electrical installation was so sophisticated that engineers of the time described it as the most advanced in the world. And this in 1901, when most American homes still used gas lighting. Who designed these systems? How were they implemented so quickly? The documentation is strangely sparse. Construction contracts that you would expect to find in municipal archives are often non-existent or incomplete. Records of workers employed in the constructions are fragmentary. Lists of materials purchased and suppliers used, information that should be meticulously documented for projects of this scale, often simply cannot be located. It's as if the bureaucratic infrastructure that should surround such massive projects was carefully erased afterward. Another intriguing aspect is the speed. The Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis, 1904, covered 1,200 acres. It included over 500 buildings. Construction officially began in 1901, giving them 3 years to complete what was essentially an entire metropolis. For comparison, modern urban development projects of similar scale take a decade or more just in the planning stages before physical construction even begins. But somehow, with century-old technology, workers of the time managed not only to plan, but to completely construct one of the largest expositions ever. Held in 3 years. And then there are the photographs of the construction process, or rather the lack thereof. For such significant events, you would expect extensive photographic documentation of every phase of construction. After all, these were marvels of modern engineering, the kind of project you would want to meticulously document. But construction photographs are surprisingly rare. What does exist often shows buildings in already advanced stages, as if they were materializing almost complete. Very few images show foundations being excavated, timber structures being erected, the initial and intermediate stages that should constitute the bulk of the construction schedule. When we compare this to modern projects, where every phase is obsessively documented, the gap is glaring. Some researchers argue that the photographic technology of the time limited what could be captured, that active construction sites were difficult environments for 19th century long exposure. Photography, but this explanation doesn't entirely hold up. Photographs of other aspects of 19th century life are abundant. We have detailed images of railroads being built, of mining, of conventional urban construction. Why would world expositions be any different? Architecture itself also presents anomalies. 19th century neoclassical buildings were typically solid constructions, designed to last for generations. Stone, brick, deep foundations. But these exhibition palaces were officially temporary, made of staff on wooden frames. How then to explain details visible in photographs that seem inconsistent with this narrative? Elaborate rainwater drainage, heating and ventilation systems, foundations that in some accidentally revealed images appear far more substantial than temporary structures would require. The Great Fire that extinguished the evidence. A pattern emerges when you map the fate of World Exposition structures. Fire. Devastating fires that consumed buildings. and, conveniently, destroyed records, architectural plans, administrative documentation. Chicago, 1894, a year after the closing of the Columbian Exposition. A massive fire destroys most of the remaining buildings that hadn't been demolished. The official cause was listed as accidental, but witnesses reported multiple simultaneous ignition points. Firefighters described the fire as abnormally intense, consuming structures supposedly made of plaster and wood with speed and heat more consistent, with more combustible or accelerant materials. The Crystal Palace in London, originally built for the Great Exhibition of 1851 and relocated to Sydenham Hill, was consumed by flames in 1936. It was one of the exhibition structures that had been preserved for decades, serving as a museum and cultural center. Then, one November night, it caught fire. 89 fire units responded. They couldn't save anything. The iron and glass structure, theoretically non-flammable, was completely destroyed. Witnesses described explosions and flames of unusual colors, suggesting the presence of burning chemicals or metals. The investigation concluded it was accidental, caused by a problem in the heating system, but many at the time questioned this conclusion. In Paris, the 1900 Universal Exposition left several buildings that were initially preserved. The Grand Palais and the Petit Palais survive to this day, permanent stone structures that were explicitly designed for longevity, but other buildings equally impressive photographically were demolished or burned in the following decades. The Palace of Electricity, a spectacular structure that housed the most advanced technological demonstrations of the exposition, was demolished in 1910. There is no satisfactory explanation as to why selected buildings were preserved, while others equally significant were destroyed. The 1915 Pan-Pacific Exposition in San Francisco built an entire city of palaces along the bay. The Palace of Fine Arts was the only building preserved, and even that was nearly demolished several times before finally being permanently rebuilt in the 1960s. All other buildings were systematically demolished in 1916, a year after the closure. Workers hired for the demolition reported difficulty in destroying the structures, describing walls that resisted jackhammers, foundations that required explosives to remove. Is this consistent with temporary plaster construction, the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition of 1876 left Memorial Hall as its only permanent remnant. All other buildings were demolished, or, in several cases, consumed by fires in the following years. The main building, which at the time was the largest structure in the world, was dismantled piece by piece and theoretically recycled. But records of where those materials went are fragmentary. You dismantle the largest building in the world, and don't carefully document the fate of each component. For projects of this magnitude, there are usually extensive paper trails, demolition contracts, debris removal records, sales of salvaged materials. Some documentation exists, but it is surprisingly incomplete, and when documents do exist, they are often superficial, lacking the detail that would be standard. It's almost as if the destruction of these structures was carried out with the same speed and lack of documentation as their original construction. Some conspiracy theories suggest that the fires were deliberately started to destroy evidence that the buildings were not what they appeared to be, that perhaps they were pre-existing structures that were incorporated into the exhibits, not built for them, that the narrative of rapid construction and subsequent demolition was a way to explain structures whose real origins were inconvenient or inexplicable. These theories seem extreme, but the anomalies are hard to ignore. Why so much fire? Why so much systematic destruction of something so impressive? Why so few surviving records? The technology that shouldn't exist. One of the most unsettling aspects of World's Fairs is the technology on display. Not the novelties and inventions that officially make history, but the infrastructure that allowed these fairs to function. Electrical systems in particular exhibit significant anomalies. The 1893 Columbian Exposition is often credited with popularizing electricity, demonstrating mass electric lighting to an audience that mostly still lived with gas lighting. But the scale of electrification went far beyond a simple demonstration. Generators supplied electricity not only for lighting, but for elaborate fountains, for the elevated transport system, for mechanical displays, for building air conditioning. Engineers estimate that the fair's electrical consumption was equivalent to that of a medium-sized city. But in 1893, generating and distributing electricity on such a scale was cutting-edge technology, newly developed by Tesla and Edison. How did a temporary fair have access to this infrastructure when permanent cities were still in the early stages of electrification. The 1901 Pan American Exposition went even further. Not only did it have extensive electric lighting, but colored lighting as well, creating nighttime spectacles where entire buildings were bathed in red, blue, and green light. The technology for controllable colored lighting existed in 1901, but it was experimental, expensive, and difficult to implement. However, here was being used on a massive scale for a temporary exhibition. The Electric Light Tower alone had over 4,000 individual lamps. The 1904 St. Louis Exposition demonstrated wireless technology. Towers transmitted signals that could be received by portable devices throughout the exposition area. This is presented as a demonstration of Tesla and Marconi's theories, but the practical implementation was surprisingly polished for such new technology. Visitors reported receiving clear transmissions without significant interference, something that would take decades to become commercially reliable. There was also transportation technology. Many expositions had electrically powered rapid transit systems, including aerial sleds, streetcars, and even motorized moving walkways, decades before such systems were common in cities. The Columbian Exposition had an elevated train system that encircled the entire area. The 1900 Paris Exposition introduced the city's first metro line, built specifically for the event but later integrated into the city's permanent infrastructure. How do temporary projects justify investment in such advanced infrastructure? Air conditioning systems also present anomalies. Several exhibition buildings had cooling and heating systems that regulated internal temperature, something that would not become common until the mid-20th century. The horticulture building at the Columbian Exposition maintained different climate zones for tropical and temperate plants. The St. Louis Exposition had the Palace of Electricity fully air-conditioned, allowing for temperature-sensitive demonstrations. The technology to do this existed at the time, but it was prohibitively expensive and rarely used even in major permanent buildings. Photography and cinematography were also widely used at these expositions, not only for documentation, but as part of the displays. The quality and quantity of surviving images is impressive, especially considering that photography was still relatively expensive and technically challenging. Some expositions had dedicated photographic studios operating on site, producing thousands of images. Cinematic documentaries were produced, some of the first motion pictures recording these events. Why so much investment in documentation for temporary events? Or does the documentation serve another purpose, perhaps creating a more controlled official narrative for these events? Maps that reveal the impossible. When you place side-by-side maps of cities that hosted major world expositions, before and after the events, something disturbing emerges. The expositions often occupied areas that in earlier maps appear as parks, undeveloped areas, or even water. But contemporary aerial photographs and topographical maps sometimes contradict this, showing structures or terrain alterations that shouldn't even be there yet. The Columbian Exposition was supposedly built in Jackson Park, an area of swamps and sand dunes along Lake Michigan. Maps of Chicago from 1890 show the area as undeveloped, but military topographical maps from the Civil War decades earlier show terrain features that seem inconsistent with virgin swamp. Unidentified structures appear on some old maps of this area. When questioned, historians suggest they were temporary structures or mapping errors, but the consistency with which these anomalies appear in multiple mapping sources is intriguing. The San Francisco Pan-Pacific Exposition occupied an area that was officially created through land reclamation of the bay. Maps show that land was added to create the exposition site, but records of how much material was moved and where it came from are surprisingly vague. Modern landfill projects of similar scale take years and leave meticulous documentation. Here, a massive area appears transformed with minimal documentation. Some old maps of San Francisco show the area in question with land contours slightly different from what the official narrative suggests, as if land already existed there before the supposed landfill. The 1900 Paris Exposition occupied the Champ de Mars and adjacent areas. 18th century Parisian maps show these areas already having significant development, including permanent structures. The official narrative is that these old structures were demolished to make way for the exhibition buildings. But comparing maps carefully, some foundations and outlines of old buildings seem suspiciously to coincide with Exhibition buildings. Is it possible that existing structures were incorporated or remodeled rather than built completely from scratch? London presents perhaps the most intriguing case. The Crystal Palace, built for the Great Exhibition of 1851, was initially erected in Hyde Park and then relocated to Sydenham Hill in 1854. Relocating such a massive structure using 19th century technology would have been an extraordinary feat of engineering. Records show it was dismantled and rebuilt, but the logistics involved seem almost impossible. Some alternative theories suggest that the Crystal Palace in Sydenham was a different structure that already existed or was built on the site, and the relocation story was a fabricated narrative. Pre-1854 London maps of the Sydenham Hill area show features that could be consistent with a large structure already present. In several cities, maps created immediately after exhibitions show permanent infrastructure changes that persist to this day. Streets, water systems, electrical networks that were supposedly installed for temporary exhibitions but then remained. This makes economic sense if you are building permanent infrastructure anyway and using the exhibition as justification. But then why were the buildings themselves destroyed? Why not integrate the structures as well, since they were built with so much effort? The inconsistency suggests that perhaps the buildings weren't built for the exhibitions, but the exhibitions were created for the buildings. That pre-existing structures of undocumented origin were temporarily repurposed as exhibition spaces before being systematically erased. This is speculation, but it explains some of the anomalies better than the conventional narrative. Photographs that shouldn't exist. When you delve into photographic archives of world expositions, you find images that raise profound questions. Quality is the first remarkable aspect. Photographs from the 1890s and early 1900s from these expositions are surprisingly sharp, well-composed, and technically sophisticated. This in an era where photography was still expensive, time-consuming, and technically challenging. Many images show moving crowds perfectly frozen, something that requires fast shutter speeds that were theoretically uncommon in photography at the time. Night images are particularly intriguing. Clear photographs of illuminated buildings at night with sharp details and balanced exposure. Night photography in 1900 was extremely difficult, requiring long exposures that would blur any movement. However, we have images of night crowds and exposures where people appear reasonably sharp, moving sources captured, and electric lights not overexposed. The technology to do this existed but was rare, and required specialized equipment and highly skilled photographers. Why were so many photographic resources dedicated to temporary events? Aerial photographs also exist from various expositions. Shots from balloons or elevated towers show panoramic views of the entire exhibition area. The aerial perspective reveals complete urban layouts, street systems, and architectural patterns. Some of these aerial images show details that seem inconsistent with recent construction. Mature vegetation patterns in areas that were supposedly recently leveled. Pathways that appear well established. In some images, the wear and tear on surfaces and structures appears greater than you would expect from buildings only months or a few years old. Comparisons are revealing. Take photographs of authentically temporary constructions from the same era. Fairground structures, camp buildings, temporary military installations. They look temporary. Simple materials, expedited construction, minimal details. Now compare them with photographs of exhibition buildings. Elaborate architecture, ornate details, quality finishing seemingly equal to major permanent buildings. The discrepancy is striking. Photographs of interiors also tell an interesting story. Exhibition halls show elaborate interior finishes, decorated ceilings, polished floors, complex fittings. All this for temporary spaces. The cost-benefit doesn't seem to make sense. You don't install handcrafted stained glass, inlaid marble floors, or intricate wood carvings in buildings that will be demolished in months. It would be like furnishing a rented house with expensive antiques. There are also photographs documenting demolitions, and these are particularly revealing. Images show workers using heavy demolition equipment, explosives, and industrial tools to destroy buildings. In several photos, the materials exposed during demolition appear far more substantial than plaster over wood. Massive stones, heavy metal beams, deep concrete foundations. Demolition rubble captured in some images seems inconsistent with temporary building materials. And then there are the photographs that have simply disappeared. Researchers investigating these exposures frequently find references to photographic collections that can no longer be located, archives lost in fires, private collections that have vanished, institutional records that are inexplicably incomplete. It is statistically unusual that so many photographic documents of such important and well-documented events at the time have been lost. The loss appears selective, with some images abundantly preserved while other categories are mysteriously rare. Survivors who tell different stories, although most of the participants and workers at these expositions have long since passed away. Written records of their experiences exist, memoirs, diaries, newspaper interviews from the time, and when you read these first-hand accounts, inconsistencies with the official narrative begin to emerge. Construction workers interviewed during and after the expositions frequently described their experiences in curious ways. Some mentioned working on buildings that already seemed partially complete when they arrived. Others described tasks that sound more like renovation and restoration than new construction. One Columbian exposition worker interviewed by the Chicago Tribune in 1893 mentioned that parts of the buildings looked much older than the official timeline would suggest, with wear and patina inconsistent with recent construction. Visitors also left interesting accounts. Some described a feeling of familiarity upon entering certain buildings, as if they had been there before, which would be impossible for newly built structures. Others commented on the acoustic quality of certain halls, noting that perfect acoustics usually takes years to be properly tested and adjusted, not something you get right on the first try in new buildings. Engineers and architects who visited the exposition sometimes left revealing technical notes. A French engineer visiting the Columbian Exposition published observations on drainage systems that he described as more sophisticated than would be necessary. For temporary structures, suggesting they were designed for longevity. A British architect at the Paris Exposition noted construction techniques in certain buildings that he did not recognize, methods that seemed old, or at least not contemporary with standard 1900 practices. Journalists of the time occasionally published pieces questioning aspects of the expositions. An 1893 article in a Chicago newspaper directly asked how construction was completed so quickly and why detailed documentation was not available to the public. The article was largely ignored, and the journalist did not publish follow-ups, which some researchers consider suspicious. There were also reports of restricted areas within the expositions, sections that were not open to the public without clear explanation. Guards were positioned in certain locations preventing access. When visitors asked why, the answers were vague, security issues or areas still under preparation, but these restricted zones persisted throughout the duration of the expositions, never opening to the public. What were they hiding? Demolition workers also left interesting accounts. Some described finding surprising internal features of buildings, hidden chambers, passageways not shown on official plans, foundations extending far deeper than necessary. One account from a demolition worker in Buffalo mentioned finding inscriptions or markings on stones that were not English and did not appear recent. Of course, these anecdotal accounts should be taken with caution. Memory is fallible. People exaggerate. Interpretations can be incorrect, but the volume and consistency of unusual reports across multiple exhibitions in multiple cities over decades suggests that there is more going on than just individual misunderstandings. When patterns emerge from multiple independent sources, it warrants investigation. The global connection that no one explains. One of the most unsettling aspects of world expositions is their global synchronicity. Between 1850 and 1915, nearly every major city in the Western world hosted at least one major exposition. London, Paris, Vienna, Philadelphia, Chicago, Buffalo, St. Louis, San Francisco, Barcelona, Brussels, Glasgow, Melbourne. The list goes on. They all followed the same basic model: massive, rapid construction, limited duration, extensive demolition afterward. It's as if there was global coordination, a central plan being executed in multiple locations simultaneously. The official narrative is that these expositions were manifestations of nationalism and commercial competition, each country wanting to demonstrate technological and cultural superiority, but the uniformity of architectural style, the similarity of technologies displayed, the consistency of structure and organization suggest collaboration rather than competition. Architects frequently worked on multiple expositions in different countries. Technologies demonstrated at one exposition appeared at Others shortly afterward. There was clearly a sharing of knowledge and resources on a global scale. But why? And coordinated by whom? There was no formal international organization overseeing these expositions. Each was officially organized independently by local or national authorities. However, the end result was remarkably consistent. It is statistically improbable that independent development would produce such uniformity. There were also curious phenomena related to timing. Several exhibitions were scheduled to coincide with anniversaries or historical milestones, centenaries of national events, celebrations of discoveries, commemorations of technological advances, but some of the milestones being commemorated were curiously arbitrary or based on questionable historical chronologies. It's almost as if the historical events were being retrospectively constructed to justify the exhibitions, rather than the exhibitions genuinely commemorating real historical events. The historical narrative surrounding the exhibitions also has suspicious consistency. Each exhibition is presented as marking a transition to modernity, celebrating progress, looking to the future. But at the same time, the architecture was profoundly retro, evoking classical antiquity, ancient Greece, and Rome. This contradiction between futuristic narrative and ancient aesthetics is rarely commented on, but it is glaring when you pay attention. Why would a celebration of modernity and technological progress be housed in buildings designed to resemble 2,000-year-old temples? The geographical distribution also raises questions. Expositions were concentrated in areas of European and American colonialism. Countries and regions outside this sphere, except when colonized or heavily influenced by the West, did not participate in the phenomenon of world expositions in the same way. This is explained as a function of industrial development. Only industrialized nations had the resources and motivation to host such events, but non-industrialized countries were often forced to participate as exhibitors, their cultures and peoples displayed in ethnographic sections that we would now recognize as deeply problematic and racist. There was clearly an agenda beyond a simple celebration of progress. A particularly intriguing global aspect is that many expositions included reconstructions of cities or towns from other parts of the world. The Columbian Exposition had a Native American village, streets of Cairo, villages of various colonized cultures. The St. Louis Exposition had representations of the Philippines, African tribes, and Asian cultures. These reconstructions were presented as educational, allowing visitors to see how other peoples lived. But in reality, they were often racist caricatures, with real people from other cultures being displayed as attractions, living in artificial environments, performing activities for the entertainment of Western crowds. This reveals something dark about the true purpose of the expositions, not just a celebration of progress, but an affirmation of racial and cultural hierarchy, a demonstration of colonial dominance. World's fairs were tools of propaganda, constructing narratives about Western superiority and manifest destiny, the systematic cover-up that continues today. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this whole story is how it has been handled by academia and official institutions. Historians acknowledge that world expositions took place, but the treatment is often superficial. You find chapters in books on urban history or architectural history, but rarely in-depth analysis of the contradictions and anomalies. When researchers ask difficult questions about unexplained aspects of the expositions, they frequently face institutional resistance. Archives are difficult to access. Documents that should exist cannot be located. Research requests are denied or delayed. It is not open conspiracy, but a passive bureaucratic resistance that effectively prevents serious investigation. Universities that have collections of exposition documents often keep these collections under restricted access. You need specific academic justification, appropriate credentials, approval from multiple instances. And even with access, researchers report that collections are often incomplete, with unexplained gaps in archives. Documents that catalogs indicate should be there simply are not, with no record of when or why they were removed. Mainstream media also shows a pattern of avoiding the topic. Documentaries about American or European history rarely devote significant time to world expositions, despite them being massive cultural and technological events that attracted tens of millions of visitors. When they are mentioned, the treatment is superficial, focusing on curious or nostalgic aspects without exploring deeper contradictions. You see the same pattern online. Try searching for detailed information on specific aspects of the expositions, and you will find limited sources. Wikipedia articles are relatively superficial compared to coverage of historical events of similar importance. Discussion forums on the topic are often dominated by skeptics who ridicule legitimate issues without actually addressing them. It's almost as if there's a coordinated effort to keep the topic marginalized, associated with conspiracy theories to delegitimize serious investigation. But why so much effort to minimize and obscure? If the expositions were exactly what official history says they were, triumphs of engineering and celebrations of progress, why not celebrate them more openly? Why not have complete and easily accessible documentation? Why aren't gaps and inconsistencies addressed directly? One possibility is that the exhibits were used to erase evidence of something earlier, an inconvenient historical narrative that needed replacing, that existing structures of unknown or poorly understood origin were incorporated into the exhibits temporarily before being permanently destroyed, removing physical evidence that contradicted established historical chronologies. Another possibility is that the exhibits were massive-scale social experiments, testing population control, propaganda, architectural manipulation of behavior, and that the true nature of these experiments remains classified or at least unofficially admitted. A third possibility, perhaps the most mundane, but still significant, is that the exhibits represent fraud and corruption on such a massive scale that admitting the truth would undermine the legitimacy of important institutions, that contracts were fraudulent, that public funds were misappropriated, that the exhibits were essentially money laundering schemes disguised as cultural celebrations. Whatever the truth, the pattern of obfuscation is undeniable, and this should make us question what else in our accepted history is being similarly concealed. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this unsettling investigation into history they've tried to erase. If this video has opened your eyes to the inconsistencies in our accepted historical narrative, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more revelations. I highly recommend you watch the next video appearing on your screen, where we explore other architectural mysteries that defy explanation. Every view, every share helps spread these truths they prefer to keep hidden. Until the next discovery.